Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is Jennifer Cooley, and I am the Education and Outreach Manager for the State Historical Museum. I hope everyone is safe and healthy in these uncertain times. Today's webinar is part of the State Historical Society's 19th Amendment Centennial Celebration. While we wanted this program to take place at Woodland Cemetery, we decided to switch it to a webinar so that you can still learn about the often overlooked women that helped shape Des Moines and Iowa. Please watch our website, iowaculture.gov/history, for details about our upcoming 19th Amendment Centennial Celebration programs. But please know that changes might be made in response to the ongoing situation. A few housekeeping points before I introduce our speaker. Everyone came into this webinar on mute and with cameras off. I have disabled the chat function, but if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A feature. My colleague Matt Beyer is watching that feature and will prepare a list of questions for the speaker at the end of her presentation. But please note, we may not be able to get to all of the questions. Now I'm happy to introduce our speaker, Kate Levasseur. Kate is a local historian who is a fifth-generation Des Moines native, and her love of history started at home as a child. While a history student at Drake University, she completed 2 internships in museum education and collections. These internships sparked an interest in educating people about history through storytelling and historic objects. Her interest in Victorian Des Moines came about while working as a historical interpreter at Living History Farms in Urbandale. Kate currently manages a museum in Des Moines and enjoys learning more about local history whenever she can. Now I'm happy to turn it over to Kate to begin the webinar.
Thanks, Jennifer, and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you so much for supporting the Women of Woodland tour, even though, as Jennifer said, and you all know, we aren't able to do it in person at Woodland Cemetery today. Sorry, I'm having a brief technical. Jennifer, my slides are not, oh, there we go. Okay, thanks everyone for your patience. This is me, just so you have an idea of who it is that you're talking with today. And again, I want to say welcome. Just a little bit about Woodland Cemetery before we begin. Though many of you may be familiar with it if you were signed up to go on the tour, for those of you who have never been there before, or maybe it's been a while, Woodland Cemetery is Des Moines' oldest municipal cemetery. It was created in 1848 when a group of farmers donated 5.5 acres of land. It expanded and is currently 69 acres with 80,000 burials. It contains 3 sub-cemeteries, so smaller cemeteries within the larger cemetery, including the Emmanuel Jewish Cemetery, the Oddfellows Cemetery. The Oddfellows were a fraternal organization that was very popular in the latter half of the 19th century. Similar to how the Masons would be a fraternal organization, and St. Ambrose Catholic Cemetery. Woodland Cemetery was designated the local historic landmark in 1986. The image you see there of the arch is the entrance, which is at the corner of Woodland and Martin Luther King Jr. Parkway. Just as some more contextual information before we jump on in, why does it matter if it's Victorian? Most of the women that we are going to be learning about today lived a majority of their life, or at least part of their life, in the Victorian era. If you're not familiar with this term, the Victorian era is the time period when Queen Victoria was ruling England. Which would be from 1837 to 1901. During this time period, the women's role in the domestic sphere played an important role in how women lived their everyday lives, and will feature prominently in the lives of the women we're going to be talking about. Uh, they were, of course, expected to be wives and mothers, raising children in particular. The next generation of Americans was an important part of the life of a Victorian woman, and their job was to run a good household, raise those children, and that's why sometimes there is the idea that women in this time period weren't able to accomplish notable achievements in their own right. And while I'm not here to say that that's not true, the goal of the tour that I've prepared today, or the webinar, is to showcase some of these women that were able to achieve some exciting things in their professional and personal lives that went beyond staying with hearth and home. Victorian views of death will figure into the Woodland Cemetery experience, since the cemetery started in this time period. Especially after the American Civil War, the country faced death on a level that it had never had to before. So this really made an impact in people's lives. And it leads into my last point here, which were cemeteries as social spaces. If you've ever gone to older cemeteries, you may have seen some cemeteries, for example, or excuse me, some gravestones shaped like benches, or spaces where people could sit and picnic. And it was not uncommon for families to come spend an afternoon, share a meal at the grave sites or the family plots of their relatives or friends, as a way to keep these people as part of their life. Because this tour and webinar are part of the 19th Amendment programming, we are going to be starting with Annie Savery. And Annie Savery lived from 1827 to 1891. The image on the left is the Savery Mausoleum. And each time I will show you a picture of a headstone or a mausoleum, I've included some information on where you can find the stone, or the mausoleum in this case, in the cemetery. The somewhat vague without having a map that has the block numbers in front of you, but hopefully it will give you an idea if you want to go find these places on your own in the future. So the Savery Mausoleum is located in Block 21 on the south side of the cemetery, close to Woodland Avenue. And we have the biographical information here on Annie Savery as a jumping off point. She was actually born in England in the year 1831, but came to America when she was young. And in 1853, when she was 22 years old, she met and married James Savery in New York. The following year, James and Annie settled in Des Moines. So this was very early in Des Moines history. And they purchased a log hotel, and Annie managed it from day to day. And this was actually the first of the couple's real estate purchases that would bring them their first fortune. And they would continue to build hotels. Eventually, there would be 3 different Savery hotels, and the third Savery hotel still exists today, the Renaissance Savery in downtown Des Moines. And in 1868, Annie Savery gave her first speech supporting women's suffrage after Iowa passed an amendment to the Constitution that expanded suffrage but did not give it to women. She was a charter member of the Polk County Women's Suffrage Association. She was an officer in the state-level Iowa Women's Suffrage Association, and eventually rose to serve on the executive committee of the National Women's Suffrage Association, where she worked with such notable names as Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. In Iowa, the suffrage amendment passed legislation in 1870, but needed to pass a second time before it would become, before voters would be able to vote on it. But it failed in 1872, partly because of the very same problem that ended up distancing Annie from the Iowa Women's Suffrage Association in the first place, which was the topic of free love. Now, some of you may hear free love and think of the 1960s counterculture free love. And while I think you can draw certain connections, the free love of the 1870s has a lot to do more with the freedom to marry, divorce, and bear children without social restriction or government interference. And as you can imagine, many women were looking for opportunities in their marriages, or I shouldn't say many women, but it was a progressive idea for women to be able to have a little more freedom within their marriages instead of the societal norm, which would be property would revert to their husband, and their husband would be the decision maker in the family. So Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton actually agreed with Victoria Woodhull and said that they supported this idea to give women more freedom within their marriages. But there were many more conservative women in the Iowa Women's Suffrage Association who did not like this idea and wanted to distance themselves from it. While Annie Savery affirmed support for traditional marriage, she argued that the suffrage movement should welcome women and supporters regardless of their position on free love. Because of this, she was ousted, is the word I've seen used, from the women's suffrage movement in Iowa and ended up turning her attention to other ventures. In 1871, she wanted to continue advocating for women to become more independent, and one of these ways was investing in a venture here in Des Moines to promote beekeeping or apiary as a business that women could have to provide themselves with income. And the bees they actually kept on site on Grand Avenue at the Savory Hotel at that point in time, which I think would have been an interesting sight to see for people going through town. Later in the 1870s, she became one of 2 women to graduate from the University of Iowa Law School in 1875. While she did appear before the Iowa Supreme Court, her goal was not to practice law, but to determine how the law could help women, continuing her advocacy. In addition to the work with the beekeeping business and her legal studies, she was an early benefactor of the Des Moines Public Library. She supported scholarships for women at the Iowa College, which is now Grinnell College, and helped improve conditions at the county jail at that point in time, which was another project that she felt passionate about. In 1878, James and Annie moved from Des Moines to Montana after suffering some financial losses in the economic depressions of the decade. James was able to rebuild his fortune through mining, and the couple ended up moving back to New York in 1883, though they maintained their ties to Des Moines. When Annie died in New York City in 1891, her body was, of course, returned to Iowa, where it was buried in the Savery Mausoleum. And I've organized this to be like we were walking, so the next stop on the tour would be Rose Connor, would be down the hill. Now, Rose Connor is kind of a unique selection for this tour because unlike a lot of the other women who are either wealthier women with progressive ideals or women who were working for these ideals, Rose Connor was born a little bit later. As you can see, she was born in 1892, and she died in 1970. The picture of her stone. And it's on the edge of a hill, so I apologize that the picture isn't quite as clear, but it's block 19 on the southwest side near Woodland Avenue. There's a hill in that corner. And I don't have an image for Rose Connor. There's one in an issue of Architectural Record from 1948, but I wanted to make sure I got the proper copyright permissions, and it was difficult to find the person who owned that image still. Just so to be safe, I did not include it, but you're welcome to go take a look. In 1892, Rose was born here in Des Moines. In the early 19-teens, she studied art and jewelry in Paris and attended the Birmingham School of Art in Birmingham, England. Back in the United States, she studied interior decoration at the New York School of Fine and Applied Art. In 1923, her family had moved out to California, and she began working as a drafter for various architecture firms in California. By the mid-1920s, she continued studying architecture in the Pasadena area and does some civic projects as an architect. But by the time she becomes a licensed architect in 1936, she opens her own firm. The focus of her design becomes designing homes for professional women, which I think is really cool that she took that into consideration when it came time to choosing clients. Interestingly, in 1942, she suspended her architecture firm and worked with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to design camouflage. There were women in World War I that were also involved in the design of camouflage. So it was about 3.5 years that instead of designing homes, she was designing camouflage. She continued designing homes for women, as well as designing housing developments until 1964, when she gave up her architecture practice after losing vision in her left eye. She never married or had children. Her architecture career was her main passion in life. And in 1970, she passed away in Claremont, California. The next stop is Dr. Ella Still, who was born in 1856 and died in 1938. This is the Still headstone. It's located in block 23 on the south side of the cemetery near the city receiving vault. She's buried next to her husband, Dr. Summerfield S. Still. Ella Still was born in 1856 in Holton, Maine. She attended public schools and then attended the University of Kansas. One of her sets of grandparents lived in Kansas. And while attending school, she met Summerfield S. Still, and they were married in 1877. After their marriage, her husband owned a mercantile business, and at that point, I haven't found what it was exactly that Ella was doing, but during this time, her husband's uncle, A.T. Still, founds the practice of, becomes an osteopathic doctor. He founds the practice of osteopathy. So her husband graduates from the American School of Osteopathy, as does she, the ASO. And in 1898, the practice was legalized here in Iowa. Now, that might sound strange, but early on, osteopathic medicine is a little different than we would think of it today. And I'm not an expert, so I'm not going to speak at length, but A.T. Still founded the practice after deciding that the medicine of the day was from doctors traditional medicine would be very barbaric, that it sometimes caused more harm than help. So he was looking for a way to help cure people that wasn't intrusive into their body. So he founded this branch of holistic medicine as an alternative medicine that would emphasize physical manipulation of muscle tissues and bones. And he set up this school in Kirksville, Missouri. So the fact that it was recognized as a legal form of medicine to practice was a big deal. And when Iowa passed the legislation to make it legal in 1898, then Ella and her husband co-founded the S.S. Still College of Osteopathy in Des Moines. And that is today Des Moines University. After taking classes to become an osteopathic doctor, Ella took additional classes to specialize in gynecology. Her professor, Dr. Robinson, said that she possessed the keenest and best trained mind any medical student or practitioner who ever passed through his hands for instruction ever had, which I think is high praise indeed for a woman that was training in the latter half of the 19th century. She, in addition to practicing in a clinic and teaching at the college, she also traveled the country to speak at different conferences and national meetings. And it was said her addresses were always scientific, practical, and helpful. She was lauded for her skill and for her bedside manner. In 1913, S.S. Still and Ella returned to Kirksville to work at the ASO, and they, however, did return to Des Moines. When Ella passed away, the newspaper not only celebrated her career, but also noted that the pallbearers would be students from the school that she and her husband founded. The next group that we're going to talk about is the Women's Relief Corps, which instead of being a person, as you can imagine, is a women's organization. This is the monument, and it's in the middle of the Grand Army of the Republic section, closest to Martin Luther King Jr. Parkway on the east side of the cemetery. Some background information about this organization. In 1879, the Women's Relief Corps was founded as a patriotic organization for women supporting the Grand Army of the Republic, which was an organization for Union veterans of the Civil War. In 1883, their formal charter for the organization was drawn in Denver, Colorado. Chapters had annual meetings around the country, and some of these annual meetings were held in Des Moines. Oftentimes on auction sites like eBay or Ruby Lane, or in antique stores, you can find ribbons from these meetings that will say what state they're in and what year. The goal of the Women's Relief Corps was to support the Grand Army of the Republic in their work, which included supporting patriotic education for children, as well as financially supporting veterans, nurses, and the widows and children of fallen soldiers. The Grand Army of the Republic's one of their main political goals was to ensure that veterans and their families received pensions from the government. And in addition to helping support that legislation, the Women's Relief Corps really did a lot to ensure that the nurses that worked on the battlefields and throughout the Civil War received pension benefits as well to help support themselves after the Civil War was done. Additionally, the women of the Women's Relief Corps supported Memorial Day by promoting the decorating of graves. So if you've seen wreaths or floral decorations as tributes of respect to fallen soldiers or veterans after they pass away, the Grand Army of the Republic and the Women's Relief Corps were instrumental in the days following the Civil War in making sure that those soldiers and veterans were being recognized. Since Iowa had the largest number of soldiers per capita go to the Civil War, you can imagine that this organization was very prominent in Iowa. It had a lot of support. And even by 1928, so more than 60 years after the Civil War ended, there were still 18,000 women, it is approximated, that were still members of this organization and actively working towards these goals of supporting veterans. Of course, by that time, World War I had taken place, as well as the Spanish-American War. So they were working towards recognizing and supporting veterans, widows, and children from all of these conflicts. The next woman that I am very happy to talk about is Cora Bussey Hillis. She was born in 1858 and died in 1924. And before I started researching for this tour, I had actually not heard of Cora Hillis before, and she has been someone that I've really enjoyed learning about, and I'm really happy to share with you today. This is her headstone, which is one in a larger family plot. Her father was actually a general in the Civil War, a Union general. So I didn't get a good picture of it, but there's a large, it just looks like a large boulder that says Hillis in front of the family plot there. So it's pretty easy to see. It's in block 10. On the east side of the cemetery near Martin Luther King Jr. Parkway, and it's almost directly across from the Women's Relief Corps Memorial, so they're very close to each other. Cora was born in 1858 in Bloomfield, Iowa, and after the Civil War, her family actually moved down to New Orleans, Louisiana. She met her husband, Isaac Hillis, and they were married soon after, and they actually met in Keokuk, Iowa. In 1887, she was one of the founding members of the Des Moines Women's Club, and my research about her has me convinced that she was a very social woman. She was a member of many organizations in Des Moines around this time. However, she did face some tragedy in her life. She lost 3 of her children, as well as an invalid sister, fairly early on, and this made her very passionate about improving the lives of children in Des Moines. She received in 1898 some clippings from her father about the Mothers Congress movement that was starting around the country. And the Mothers Congress movement would eventually become what is now the PTA. But some quotes that I found about the Mothers Congress from a great article called Cora Bussey Hillis, Woman of Vision, is to give you a little bit of an idea of what this was. The Congress was breaking new ground, asking that parenting be recognized as a profession that demands creativity, responsibility, and that women, as primary caretakers of the nation's children, had just as much need and just as much right to come together for educational, social, or political goals as did any other profession. So this really was a great organization for Cora to be a part of because she had already advocated, started her advocacy work in Des Moines for children. One of her first projects was a swimming pool or a swimming area in the Des Moines River. As a child, she had actually been around near a friend who had drowned, and it left a lasting impact on her. So on her own, she decided it was important to have a safe public swimming space for the children of Des Moines. So she personally campaigned for funds, got the press involved, and even rounded up rental bathing suits so that if the children didn't own a bathing suit, they could still participate. And 4,000 children ended up using the safe swimming area in the first week, which I think is pretty awesome. In 1904, while she was in the midst of her work with the Mothers Congress movement, she also began campaigning for an Iowa juvenile court system, and she began speaking with farmers' institutes about how to create a more scientific study of children. This was particularly relevant to discuss with farmers because she felt that there was more scientific knowledge about how to raise animals and how to raise crops than there was about raising children. Her speeches to these farmers' institutes were entitled Fields Worth Cultivating, Seeds Worth Sowing, or Child Culture versus Corn Culture. She continued to push for a more scientific study of child rearing, partly because of her sister who had been an invalid, and partly she felt that a better study of children, their milestones developmentally and their health would perhaps have allowed her sister more health opportunities as she was growing, because no doctor that the family had ever consulted knew or was able to provide any answers about what was wrong, and all had different opinions on the subject. Another thing that Cora was very concerned about was the infant mortality rate. In 1912, Cora worked to pass a vital statistics bill that would help record birth and death statistics for children in an effort to lower the infant mortality rate. However, the bill, while passed committee, did not pass in the legislature. And she received a letter from one of her fellow colleagues who was in the legislature that they wanted to put the money towards a hog serum or something more concrete and productive to Iowa's farming communities. Not to be daunted by that, Cora founded the Des Moines Child Welfare Association in 1912-1913. She formed committees within the association that would handle birth registrations, and in the first year, they were able to register 90% of babies born in Des Moines. They distributed free ice and milk to mothers. She established a system of visiting nurses to help care for the children. And one of her biggest projects was a fresh air camp in the summer of 1913. As you can imagine, partly getting fresh air out of the city was one of the goals of this camp, but perhaps the more lasting legacy was the nutrition classes and the financial classes. For example, her goal was to teach young and poor mothers how to avoid loan sharks. And there are some great pictures pictures of Cora with sleeping babies in a nursery where she and the other women volunteering with her stayed and watched the babies so that the young mothers would go have a chance to go take a nap. And as the mother of an 8-month-old myself, I can say that that was, I'm sure, very much appreciated. She knew that the work could expand even further, and she spent many years approaching colleges and universities to establish a research facility to look more formally into child development. Finally, in 1917, the Iowa Child Welfare Research Station was established at the University of Iowa. And the timing of this ended up being a little stressful for her because this was right before the United States entered World War I. But it also emphasized the importance when it was published in the Des Moines Register that there were a lot of young men that weren't able to pass their physical. And Cora felt that had there been more knowledge and more work towards keeping children healthy, that would not have been a problem. Her work went, she spread her ideas around other states. Her work was one of her largest passion projects, and other states had begun picking up on the ideas when Cora sadly died in 1924 in an automobile accident near St. Cloud, Minnesota. All right, I'm just going to forward my slide. Apologies for the delay. Well, I apparently am stuck. Apologize. I have one more woman for us to talk about today. There we go. Ellen Flynn. And Ellen is a little, I will admit, is definitely a favorite of mine because when I worked at Living History Farms, I worked at the Flynn Mansion, which was one of the places where she lived. And here is a photo of her stone. It's in the St. Ambrose Block 9 on the northeast side near Martin Luther King, excuse the typo there, Junior Parkway. And St. Ambrose, as for those of you that don't know the connection, is the St. Ambrose Catholic Church downtown. The family were members there. And so it's in that Catholic section of the cemetery. Some biographical information for Ellen. There you see both 1842 and 1843 as potential birth dates. The stone says 1842, but there is some other information that indicates it could be 1843. But she was born in Ireland, and very early in her life, she immigrated to New York with her parents. She had 2 younger brothers born in New York. They ended up moving across the United States westward until they got to Douglas County, or Nebraska, which is the Omaha area. In the 1860 census, we see her listed as working as a domestic servant. And in 1864-65, again, there are some inconsistencies, but in 1865, we'll say she marries Martin Flynn in Omaha, Nebraska. Martin Flynn was a railroad contractor, and in Omaha, he was working for the Union Pacific Railroad. And while we don't know exactly how the two met, it would appear that he worked with her brother and father. And after their marriage, moved to Iowa and into the Des Moines area. And in 1870, they're living in Walnut Township, Iowa, and have 3 of their eventual 10 children. Now, so far, I think some people might be wondering what is notable about Ellen. And I think partly I want to emphasize the sort of immigrant American dream story. She went from, living in Ireland to becoming upwardly mobile. The house at Living History Farms is 5,000 square feet, and her husband had made quite a bit of money, both with railroad contracting and with breeding cattle. And on a farm at this time period, in addition to the work of child rearing that Ellen would have been working every day, she also was feted as being an expert with her chickens. And 10 children, I think, is a big job for anyone. They had 5 boys and 5 girls. She was a member of, again, St. Ambrose Catholic Church, and she belonged to different women's organizations that were doing good in the community, including the Daughters of Ceres, which was an agricultural organization for women. And perhaps the second very interesting part of her story that I'm presenting as a counterpoint is that she was actually an anti-suffragist. In 1912, she was actually named president of a local anti-suffrage organization. I want to provide you some context before we immediately jump on, from a modern perspective, the idea that she was crazy for having anti-suffrage ideals. And this is circling back to the women's sphere mentality or social order of this time period. And if you research the anti-suffrage movement, again, it's easier for us from our modern viewpoint to say these women didn't know what they were talking about. They were backwards, they were uneducated, they were brainwashed by their husbands or men. But a lot of anti-suffragists were women who wanted to help in their communities, who believed that that was an important part of society. And perhaps most importantly, it was a generally held belief in this time period that politics by their very nature was corrupt. And therefore it wasn't something that women belonged in, because their job was to be good role models for their children, to produce good children, good citizens, and that the civic engagement that women were promoting was through good works, through their church, through volunteer organizations. So a lot of women that were anti-suffragists felt that they could do good work and they could improve the country. It just wasn't going to be through the ballot box. And there were many very highly educated women who were anti-suffragists. If you want a good, succinct argument for anti-suffrage, just for the sake of edification, look up Lillian Edgerton. She was a traveling speaker in the 1870s. She was an anti-suffragist, and once I read a transcript of one of her talks, it gave me some different perspective on the issue. I'm not saying I agree, but it definitely gave me a better understanding of where that side was coming from, at least from the perspective of one anti-suffragist. Now, of course, you'll see in the biographical sketch in 1916 that Ellen attended a suffrage tea at the Yonkers Tea Room. The article about this in the Des Moines Register is very interesting to read. It was significant enough that it did make the paper. And at this point, you can see that Ellen was in her 70s. And in the article, it said she stood up on a chair and addressed the room and said that she ultimately decided to support suffrage, changing her mind at this point in her life, because she had seen how the world was for her daughters as they grew and the opportunities that they could have with the vote. She had traveled more extensively, which was an area where women were granted suffrage before they were granted suffrage on a federal level. And she had seen that none of the potential moral issues that anti-suffragists were concerned about, none of those had occurred. There was no high moral decline. Women were still participating in their domestic life and still able to vote. And it was observing these things in action that had changed her mind and switched her loyalties from anti-suffrage to the suffrage movement. In 1922, Ellen passed away in Des Moines and was buried in the family plot in Woodland Cemetery. All right. My next slide is for questions, Matt. So we're welcome.
Oh, thank you, Kate. Let's go ahead and move into that. What I will say first before we get started, first of all, thank you, Kate, for all the great information. I really appreciate hearing more and more about these people who often have been overlooked in history. The second thing I'll say is that, yes, there'll be a recording of this webinar available at a later date, so we'll get working on that. We'll have it out to everyone soon, so just be looking out for that as well in the future. As for other things as well, if you want to go and see a map, there are some maps online you can find. If you Google Woodland Cemetery map, some pull up in the Google Images search. So you can look for these blocks that Kate mentioned when she gave directions to each one as you explore. Also, our museum does have a blog, and a couple years back, we did one called Stories in Stone from Woodland Cemetery. We'll include a link to that with a follow-up email. And that has some great information about other famous people who reside currently within Woodland Cemetery. So with that out of the way, we have some questions to ask. So Mike did ask, are there any graves of notable women buried in Woodland Cemetery that are not currently marked or that you would like to see marked?
That's an excellent question. At this time, I don't have any, but my research continues. So this is definitely a topic that I'm interested in, and maybe we can get together again for round 2 and I'll be able to include some more ladies.
Actually, and a follow-up to that, Kate, too, is there anyone who you would have liked to include in our presentation today but couldn't because of time?
Yes, I think so. There are, and I know this sounds a little odd considering that the idea that we're putting forth here is we're talking about notable women, but there are a lot of women in the cemetery who were still living their everyday lives, and those are really interesting stories as well. There's one stone that just caught my attention. It's close to the Rose Connor, so on the south side there. Mary Turnipseed is her name, and maybe it was Turnipseed's last name that interested me, but just looking into her life, her first husband was killed in a boxing match. She ended up being married 2 or 3 more times. Some of those divorces because she had a very rough life, but her children, one of her children ended up becoming a beloved police commissioner. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is there are many women who have amazing stories, and it's hard to know until you look into them. So I think there's a lot of scope for recognizing some amazing women in there.
There are lots of stories, I think you can tell within the Woodland Cemetery. So our next question comes from Michelle. How did you pick who to research? These women are so interesting.
Excellent question. Some of the women that I chose, I was already familiar with. Annie Savery, I knew already from just studying suffrage, and Ellen Flynn, as I mentioned. I got to interpret on a professional basis for my job at Living History Farms. And the Women's Relief Corps I knew about because I actually did my college undergraduate thesis on the Grand Army of the Republic. And in my internship at collections at the State Historical Society, one of my jobs was sorting the ribbons from these encampments and meetings from the Grand Army of the Republic and the Women's Relief Corps. So I can thank Jody for that one. And Cora Hillis showed up. It was actually recommended to me by a friend when I asked if she knew of any interesting women. So that was a recommendation just from another friend who's interested in history. And Rose Connor, I was typing in, I can't remember what my search was, but basically I was doing a search of professional women from Des Moines, early Des Moines, and she popped up in that search. And of course, her section was a little shorter, but I thought that was really interesting, especially her work with camouflage. So I thought that she should definitely be included.
Thank you. So we have a question from Leo. Do you know if Ellen Flynn supported or opposed temperance, and if her opinion played a role in her suffrage views?
That is an excellent question. I focus more both professionally and for this on temperance, or excuse me, on suffrage. But for those that are unfamiliar with the issue, a lot of the time the two were intertwined. So because obviously, as you can imagine, if the men in your life were out drinking, which is what the temperance ladies would be concerned about, it was harder on your home life. So that might be one, and I'm going to apologize to my LHF family that may be on this webinar. That might be one I have to look up, but off the top of my head, I focus more on the suffrage by itself as opposed to the two connected.
Another interesting story to research.
Mm-hmm.
To add to the list. So another question, and this is a great question, I think, because it involves a contemporary look. But someone asked, based on the owners, the women's biographies, the people we talked about today, what would they think of the women of today? Would they be as involved for their communities?
That is a fantastic question, and one that I think about even going back to the mid 20th century. If you, the idea of, like, for example, a lot of my friends know I enjoy the show Bewitched. So middle class and upper class women that did not have a job in the sense of a career outside of the home, which of course is an important job, that especially once their children were in school, they had time to do more volunteer work, belong to more civic groups than perhaps we would think of as having time for today, when, you know, mom, your sister, yourself, you're all working, you know, your job, and then want to spend time with your family or have your own time. So I think that these women would be impressed that the women of today have opportunities that they either didn't have or were working so hard for, and would have interesting conversations with women that are very involved in civic groups today or have jobs related to civic interests, how they balance those things, or how you delineate what your priorities are. So I think they would be both impressed and interested in how everything pans out in modern women's lives.
Thank you, Kate. And our last question is one that I actually will ask you. How did you go about doing your research, and what's your favorite research techniques about looking up these women that we talked about today?
Definitely newspapers.com. Anyone that is even just interested for the fun, newspapers.com is a great resource, or any sort of a digital newspaper repository. And I think Ancestry as well. And it's not that I want everyone to go pay for subscriptions to these services, or I'm hawking them in any way. Those are just personally what I use because I have an interest personally in genealogy and again, local history. So, but just the types of census documents, to be more general, newspapers, visiting archives to see the physical copies or on film is really great. And honestly, Google eBooks, if you search those, libraries have been digitizing all sorts of things. So a lot of the information, even on Dr. Ellis Still, showed up in publications related to, osteopathic medicine that were published in the 19-teens that there's no way I would have just found on my own looking for fun. So there are definitely a lot of easy to access web resources to get people started.
Perfect. Thank you, Kate. So I said last question before, but there's a good question that popped up, and I think you can answer it pretty quickly. And this is our final question. Do you have any book recommendations that cover the Victorian time period, maybe covering history of women's suffrage on a national scale, or any book recommendations you might have for someone looking at this time of history?
I was actually putting together a bibliography of my sources, and so I think maybe you and Jennifer and I could get together and maybe would it be possible to post a bibliography or send out some information? Because I think I have a few options, and I think maybe you have some too that we could share.
Yeah, of course. I will make a quick recommendation. Judith Flanders is like my hero for Victorian domestic studies. And she has some great books, but we'll get together and we'll create a list, and that'll go out to with our email post this. So thank you, Kate. We're running at a time right now, so we'll say thank you for your research and making us have a very informational and a great learning experience for lunchtime today. And to everyone joining us today, thank you again for joining us at the State Historical Museum of Iowa. We're happy you could join us. Like we said before, please check out our website, iowaculture.gov, for more programming and different things you can do to learn more about our great state's history. And we look forward to seeing you virtually again in the future. Thank you all.
Thank you.